Good morning, Michelle.
Good morning, Stephen.
It's been a week when our thoughts have been focused internationally for obvious reasons. In your column, Grattan, on Friday, you discuss Australian-American relations, and you suggest that the relationship with the US and President Obama is now more comfortable with Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister than Tony Abbott. Why do you say that?
I think the two are more of a natural fit, that Malcolm Turnbull's sympathies would be politically more in tune with President Obama's. Tony Abbott, of course, took a very hard line on things. He was noticeably critical, not so much publicly but privately, of the Americans in terms of the fight against Islamic State. He really was always anxious for this to be ramped up, for some changes of strategy.
Well, he's currently arguing for boots on the ground, as the saying goes, but this seems to be opposed by everyone except perhaps bootmakers. What are the reasons for reluctance, not just here but in the US and the UK, to have troops actually on the ground in the Middle East now?
I think, especially in terms of the US, they do, of course, remember the enormous Iraq commitment years ago, and that didn't end very well, didn't achieve its purpose in the longer term. There's not the domestic constituency for another big American commitment of ground forces. Afghanistan's just behind them, so that drives their perception of things. In terms of Australia, the government often points out we've got the second largest military commitment, second to the US, already in this fight, and I think there's a feeling that we don't want to increase it if we don't have to. Of course, if the Americans put the weights on us, it would be another matter. But we wouldn't be going out there under Malcolm Turnbull to boost it, and rather Turnbull is talking very much about the peace process and the fact that there needs to be some sort of settlement in Syria to get a long-term better outcome and a stronger fight against Islamic State via a more coordinated approach.
Well, one fly in the ointment of cordial relations with the US at the moment seems to be the 99-year lease over the Port of Darwin, which is being granted to a Chinese company called Landbridge Group. It seems that the lease is by the Northern Territory government. It doesn't have to go to the Foreign Investment Review Board. The Department of Defence was consulted and seemed to have no problem about it. But Peter Jennings of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute claims that it's a deep strategic mistake, and it turns out that the Americans are unhappy about it, or at least unhappy about not being consulted in advance. What actually is the problem with this?
Well, the Americans thought that they should have been given prior notice before the announcement by the Northern Territory government that this was happening. Malcolm Turnbull has rather dismissed this by saying, well, maybe they should take out a subscription to the Northern Territory News. In fact, they read it in the Wall Street Journal because there had been a lot of talk about this. Now, I think that sort of trivialisation doesn't necessarily serve the government that well, because the United States is clearly somewhat upset about the process here, and with some reason. I think they would prefer the Port of Darwin not to be leased by the Chinese, but the point that they are making is about lack of forewarning. And the Australians say, well, this is a matter for us, and if Defence is happy, if ASIO is happy, if the Australian military force is happy, then there's no problem.
Going to the substance of it rather than the consultation point, 99 years is a long time. One thing we could be sure of is that global relations will be different in 99 years' time. Is that in itself a risk for this?
Well, it's certainly a factor to take into account, one would think, and Peter Jennings makes the obvious point that you're looking into a period in the future which is as long as the period from the Gallipoli landing to now. And when you think about it in those terms, well, the world looked very different in 1915, didn't it?
Indeed. In contrast to all of this, this. Scott Morrison is ruling out a foreign acquisition of the Kidman pastoral empire, which represents 1.3% of Australia's total land area, citing national security grounds. Now, he's ruled out this specific purchase, not necessarily an amended proposal, but I wonder whether the government has a consistent line yet on foreign acquisitions.
It's trying very hard to send out a message that this decision is not a decision against foreign investment as such, it's not a discouragement of foreign investment, but of course sending out consistent messages is very difficult. In this case, it's a question of the extent of this land. It's just enormous. It's in about 10 big stations, and of course it's quite an iconic empire in Australian history, a cattle empire built up by S.Kidman. But also there's a national security consideration because some of the land in fact is on the Woomera broad testing area, and that raises security matters.
Well, as you say, 99 years ago the world looked a different place. Even 9 days ago it looked a bit different. Let's see how it looks next week. Thanks for your time, Michelle.
Thanks, Stephen.